We just finished the dyslexia simulation, and that is to bring more awareness to what dyslexia, a day in the shoes of someone with dyslexia feels like. And so I would like to continue to bring different things to our district to bring more awareness, create conversations, and more collaboration with our families and our staff at the school. So thank you very much for having me this evening.
Thank you, Trina, and thank you for the work that you do with our families. It's very important and much appreciated. I just want to say that thank you, Lauren, for reminding me to record. We are recording this meeting, and so if there is anyone who would want to maybe stop their video, you can do that now. I'm sure our next speaker needs no introduction, but I'd like to share some details about our Superintendent of Shaker Heights City School District, Dr. David Glasner. Dr. Glasner previously served as interim principal of Shaker Heights High School, executive director of curriculum and instruction, and principal of Shaker Heights Middle School. Prior to coming to Shaker Heights, Dr. Glasner served as a principal and social studies teacher in New York City. He holds a BA and an MA in history from the University of Pennsylvania and a master's degree in social studies education from Teachers College, Columbia University. Dr. Glasner earned his doctorate in urban education at Cleveland State University. He and his wife, Alana, a math teacher, have 3 children. It's a very special evening to have Dr. Glasner here with us to speak about the Forward Together initiative. As many of you know, Forward Together is a collaboration between the City of Shaker Heights, the Shaker Heights City School District, and the Shaker Heights Public Library to jointly fund and lead a process to develop a facilities master plan for the Shaker Heights community. So please welcome Dr. David Glasner.
Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you, Armina, for that wonderful introduction and for helping to coordinate this. Thank you, Trina, for all the work that you do. And it is great to see everybody this evening. As Armina mentioned, my topic for this evening is to focus on the Forward Together process, the joint facilities planning process that we're currently engaged in with the city and with the library, and to talk about the long-term facilities planning process that is specific to our schools and our facilities in the school district. I'm going to share my screen so I can share some slides with everybody. There will be some opportunities for some interaction, some conversation, and certainly some questions, either verbally or through the chat. So just want to make sure you're prepared to share your questions and your thoughts as we go along this evening. All right, let me just get my slide ready here. Go. All right, thumbs up if everybody could see. You can see the screen. All right, thank you. So I'm going to start just by talking a little bit about the overall Forward Together process, some of the big goals, and then we'll talk a little more in depth about issues or topics that are specific to the schools. I think as many of you are aware, we've been engaged in the Forward Together process really pretty intensively over the past year. The goal of this process is to create a joint facilities master plan, really a plan that will help to shape and to think about the facilities that we have as a community for the long term. One of the things that is unique about Forward Together is that we're doing this collaboratively with the city and with the library, because we know that there are facilities that we can collaborate on, and services and support that we can collaborate on to better meet the needs of the Shaker Heights community. Some of you may remember about 2 years ago, there was a process led by the city to create a Forward Together visioning plan. That plan identified some priorities for our work together. one of those priorities, really one of the top priorities, was to address the facilities that we have here in our city: school buildings, community buildings, places like Thornton Park, our library branches, and think about what the long-term future of those facilities might include. And so we have been working towards building that master facility plan, and your input and engagement is key to that process. So, you know, obviously you can read the slide here, but one of the things that is key to this process is that we all believe that by working together, we're going to be able to better meet the needs of our community. We know that, and this is true for the schools, like it is for the city and for the library, that many of our buildings are old and not getting any younger. They do not meet the modern needs of our students or our community members. And we as a community can think innovatively about how to create both facilities and programming inside those facilities that will meet our student and community needs. In the Forward Together process, we have identified some key goals or intended outcomes for this process. And you'll see the list in front of you. I think you'll see that this is pretty ambitious, and we're being pretty all-encompassing in the work that we're doing. Some of the goals that we want to make sure we accomplish include benefiting all of our entities and operations. This is not just a schools project or a city's project or library project. We think that this process can benefit all of the different entities in this community. We think it's important that we give our community a competitive edge. Just speaking from the schools perspective, we know that many of our neighboring districts and across this region have modernized and upgraded many of their facilities. That's true for city facilities and library facilities as well. And so when people choose to live in Shaker, we want them to know that they're getting the best facilities out there. We think it's important that we adapt to the future. The needs of our students and our community members are very different now than they were 50 or 100 years ago when many of our buildings were built. So we need to adapt to what the future holds. We also prioritize sustainability. And I mean that in two respects. I mean that both from an environmental or eco-friendly perspective, but also in terms of our ability to maintain and sustain our buildings and our facilities. We have to be sustainable in how we think about that. We want to avoid creating unintended consequences. We know that over the course of the history of Shaker, the way that facility planning and city planning has taken place has sometimes created unintended, or in some cases intended, consequences that has marginalized parts of our community or members of our community. And we want to avoid repeating those same trajectories this time around. We want to respect and acknowledge our city's beauty and history. It's something that makes Shaker unique, while also modernizing our facilities in our community. And ideally, we want a process that brings our residents together. To be frank, we know that this process could have the potential to pull people apart rather than bring people together. And we think it's important that this is seen as a process that brings our community together. So I started by taking kind of the big picture. I'd like to invite everybody to think a little bit about our school facilities, since this is a PTO meeting. And I would like to invite folks to use the chat function, if you can, on your screens, just to complete this sentence. Our facilities should. What would you like to see our facilities, and what are your goals for our facilities? What do you want to see from our facilities? You're welcome to talk specifically about school facilities, school buildings. If you want to expand to build city or library facilities, you're welcome to include those too. But I'll monitor the chat or I guess, Armina, can you monitor the chat? I'm not sure I can actually see the chat since I'm sharing my screen.
Yep, sure, I can keep an eye on the chat.
So I'll give folks a few minutes to, there we go. I see people starting to put some messages in there. Again, complete the sentence. Our facilities should. How would you like that sentence to be finished? I'll let some folks put comments in the chat and then I'll continue.
So Dr. Glasner, would you like me to just read them as they come in?
You know, you are welcome to. That would be helpful. I actually was able to pull it up also so I can see.
Okay.
Putting, but for everybody else, it might be good if you could read some of them as they come through, Harmina.
So our facilities should be built up, not torn down. Our facilities should have flexibility of use. They should respect the past and embrace the future. Combine the historical beauty of Shaker with the modern needs to our students and community. And our facilities should make everyone welcome when they walk in the doors, children, families, and those working there.
All right, folks are welcome to continue adding to the chat as we talk this evening. I see some more coming in. Harmony, you want to read those and then I'll continue in a minute.
Sure. Our facilities should be accessible to our entire community, including those with disabilities. Our facilities should include a conversation about our facilities should include the athletic fields and green spaces.
So thank you everybody for your ideas. And again, feel free to keep putting ideas in the chat. It's great to hear all of those thoughts and ideas. And I will say that they very much align with where we hope this process will lead us. I'll start with the end. This process does include thinking about our athletic fields and other assets in our community, not just the bricks and mortar of our buildings. And we want our buildings to be welcoming and support the modern needs of our students. I'll share some of the things that we've been talking about as we think about completing the sentence. We believe that it's important that our facilities should support modern education and meet the needs of today's students and staff. We know that our buildings were not designed with modern educational needs in mind. Maybe one of the more obvious or talked about examples we often discuss is just technology and how our spaces were designed for different technological needs. That could be outlets or different ways to access technology in a classroom, but also the way that we know students learn best through collaboration, through building relationships, through being able to access different disciplines at the same time. We know that's a very different model than the industrial economic model that any of our classrooms were built using. We know also that our facilities need to be structured in a way that supports diversity, equity, and inclusion. I know in some of the comments that people made, you talked about our spaces being welcoming. We want to make sure that every student feels like they belong in our schools, and that our facilities are structured in a way that reinforces that message, that we pride ourselves here in Shaker actually on being able to provide learning experiences that are inclusive and diverse and equitable, and our facilities need to reflect that. Lastly, we believe that it's important that our facilities enable our district to operate efficiently and be a good steward of public dollars. We know that we have declining enrollment right now. It's a trend that has existed for a long time because of declining birth rates. So just as an example, we know that our buildings were built for many more students, and we have to address that in the future of our facilities. We also know that environmental sustainability is important and also leads generally to cost savings when we're more efficient and energy-wise. Those are two things that capture kind of this guiding principle, that it's important that we're good stewards of our public dollars. So I want to talk a little bit about how we make this happen. We're lucky in Ohio because the state provides funding to support school construction and renovation. The state has a commission called the Ohio Facilities Construction Commission, the OFCC, that supports school districts in building new buildings or renovating their buildings. We have entered the process with the OFCC because they provide both financial support and also other design and architectural support as we go through this planning process. Some of you may be familiar with the OFCC because you heard me talk about it, or because the last time we started a master planning process, we also engaged with the OFCC. So I apologize if I'm being repetitive. But there are some key points that I want people to be aware of in terms of state support. And some of this has actually changed over the past few years, I think, to our benefit. First of all, the OFCC does have state standards that they use to help guide district construction or renovation processes, but they're also very flexible. We work with kind of an OFCC coordinator whose job is to really be a partner with our district. And so there is flexibility. They work with us on establishing appropriate timelines, on designing spaces, or thinking about plans that meet our community needs. There's also a high quality that comes to our district through the OFCC process, just in terms of the type of facility. I know sometimes we think about state-sponsored facilities and maybe high quality is not the first thing that comes to mind. But actually the OFCC has really gotten a lot of experience on building excellent school buildings. In a minute, I will show you some pictures of some of the school buildings that they've helped support. And I think we have to consider the quality of the school buildings that we will hopefully get if we enter and go through this master planning construction and renovation process. Lastly, but I think it's critical, so certainly not least, the state, as part of this process, funds 36% of eligible work. What that means is if the overall project costs $100 million, the state will provide 36 million of those dollars. Now they only provide funding for eligible components of construction or renovation, but a lot of what we'll be doing is eligible. There are other elements that we as a community have to support on our own. Those are called locally funded initiatives, or LFIs. But just to give you some perspective of how much of an opportunity this is, when we entered the master planning process with the OFCC about 5 or 6 years ago now, we were expecting to get about 23 or 24% of co-funding eligibility. So it's gone up, which is great, to a little over a third of the process. I will say, in talking with other folks around the state, they think that this is pretty good. This is pretty good. It's not that common for school districts to get this kind of support. School districts like Shaker, I should add, to get this level of support from the OFCC. So it's just something for us to keep in mind, essentially, that there is money on the table for us to use to support this work. So I just want to show some examples of OFCC sponsored projects. You'll see on the left is Lancaster High School in Lancaster. On the right, I believe, is a picture from North Olmsted. Both districts have recently gone through construction and renovation projects. And I chose these two pictures because I think it's important that, some folks actually mentioned in the chat, it's important that we modernize our buildings while also trying to maintain the historical nature and architectural design that exists in Shaker. I think these are two examples of buildings, may not be exactly like Shaker, but I think hopefully demonstrate that there is the ability for architects to create buildings that have both historic nature and modern insides. And you'll see on the inside, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, the picture on the left is from one of the Strongsville schools that was recently renovated. And the one on the right is an auditorium in a North Olmsted building. You can see from these pictures just that they're a lot more modern than our buildings are. The auditorium in this picture was upgraded with all the newer audio-visual lighting equipment, that kind of stuff. And on the left, you'll see, this is a space that is open, that is collaborative, that allows students and staff to work together. And there are many, many more pictures I can show, but these are just some examples of what schools, modern schools, can look like with OCC support. So I know there are a lot of questions that often come up when we talk about our facilities as well as the OFCC support. One of those questions is whether we have too much space and why does it matter? I know I often talk to people who say, I'd prefer that we have isn't it good to have too much space? It's better than having too little space. The OFCC does have standards when it comes to the amount of space in our school buildings because our enrollment has declined. Based on the OFCC standard, we have excess square footage in many of our buildings. Why does that matter? Well, it matters for two reasons. First of all, what we have is not good excess square footage. So our classrooms, just as an example, generally are smaller than the OFCC recommended classroom size. So even though we have excess square footage in our buildings, in our classrooms, we have less square footage than they recommend typical classrooms are. Kindergarten classrooms would be a good example. Many of our kindergarten classrooms are smaller than the OFCC recommends. Secondly, it's not good excess square footage that we have in the sense that the square footage that we have largely isn't dedicated to making the best learning spaces possible. I know at the high school, two examples I can give of that would be the rifle range in the basement of our high school. For those of you who don't know, we have a rifle range, an old rifle range in the basement of our high school. It's no longer obviously used as a rifle range, but it's also not really a modern educational space that we can use very well. The third floor of our high school is another example. Narrow hallways, very poor climate control. It's not air conditioning. It's not air conditioned. It gets very stuffy whenever the weather is even mildly warm. And it's not a good space for students to learn in or collaborate in. We also, in terms of thinking about being fiscally responsible, all of the facilities that we have, when we have so much excess square footage, it costs more to run them. And it costs more to run them, not only because we have to regularly maintain them, but also because many of them are falling apart. So we have to put more dollars into just keeping our buildings up and keeping them ready and prepared for students on a daily basis because they're old and they're not in great shape. So how does our space compare to the OCC standard? As I mentioned, based on the OCC standard, we have too much square footage in our buildings, but not enough square footage in our learning spaces. So one thing that I do want to point out, because I often get this question, does the OFCC believe that classrooms should be bigger because class sizes should be bigger? They do have standard calculations they use for classroom sizes and the number of students in a classroom. We do have flexibility, however, in making adjustments as we see fit. So, for example, the OFCC might say we should have 5 kindergarten classrooms and each should be 1,200 square feet large. We might say, you know what, we would rather have 6 kindergarten classrooms and make each classroom 1,000 square feet large. So we have flexibility within the guidelines to build schools and classrooms that really meet the needs of our community and our students and our staff and faculty. Another question that we get a lot, especially as we've gone a little deeper in this process, is the question of neighborhood schools and community assets. And I think this is a particularly relevant conversation given that I'm speaking tonight to the PTOs from all of our elementary schools. I want to just, before I jump into this topic, I want to acknowledge that this is a really important one for our community to navigate as we think about the long-term future of our facilities. I also think it's important that we discuss what we mean by neighborhood schools, what we mean by community assets, where there are spaces for reimagining how we use our facilities and what our neighborhoods and communities mean for us. So I did want to just start with some information, because I think it's important for us to be clear what we mean when we talk about neighborhood schools. I know when I talk to people, they often say, you know, neighborhood schools are neighborhood schools, partly because of their location. They are schools in neighborhoods, but also because many students have the opportunity to walk to schools, and it really is a hub of the community, because many families who live around the school can access the facility both during the school day, but also at other times. And the data is a little, kind of paints a little bit of a different picture. Our truest neighborhood schools, if you think about neighborhood schools based on who gets or how many people walk to those schools or have the ability to walk to those schools, Fernway and Lomond are our two, kind of what I guess I would say are our truest neighborhood schools. You'll see that in terms of who takes the bus to school or who is eligible to take the bus to school, at Fernway, about 33% or 94 students out of 304 students are eligible to take the bus to school. At Lomond, it's even lower, so about 19% of students who attend Lomond, or about 64 students out of 342 students, are eligible for transportation to Lomond. At the other three elementary schools, it's quite a bit different. Onaway is about 39%, or about 161 students are eligible for transportation. Boulevard and Mercer, over 60% of students are eligible for transportation. I think another important point to introduce is that across the district, over 70% of the students who ride Shaker school buses or who are eligible for transportation are Black. Now that has to do with decisions that were made long before this Forward Together process, and certainly has to do also with the value we place on having integrated schools. But it is a point that I think we need to be cognizant of as we move ahead with the facilities planning process. So just some questions to think about as we think about neighborhood schools or schools in our neighborhoods. And these are questions that are starting to come up through the Forward Together process. First, how can we reimagine community assets to create neighborhood hubs? Are there ways that we can think about neighborhood hubs, not just as schools, but also what else can we do to create neighborhood hubs? Maybe those are fields or athletic facilities or rec centers or other kinds of facilities that we can use to ensure that our neighborhoods, as many neighborhoods as possible, continue to have hubs in the neighborhood that really help to build community feeling, community spirit, and community connections. Secondly, how do we balance these goals of equity, community, and fiscal responsibility? I recognize that the decisions that we have ahead of us are going to be difficult. And I know I started by talking about a process that brings our community together. We know that the questions and decisions we're going to have to make, people are going to be coming at from different perspectives. And it's going to require us to balance these different goals, wanting to be inclusive, wanting to be equitable, wanting to ensure that we have community, that we build a sense of community in this city, and also that we are good stewards of our public dollars and are efficient in our practices and provide fiscal responsibility. So I know that is a big ask and a hard goal to aspire to, but I do believe this process is setting us up to allow that to happen. So I want to talk a little bit about what this process looks like. This is our current timeline. It's as always, always subject to change if we get more information or if we have to. I know one of the things that is really critical to this process is community engagement. So we want to make sure that everybody here and everybody who's not here has the opportunity to provide input and to engage in this process. We had in the Forward Together visioning process in 2019, there were some rounds of public engagement. We had one round of public engagement that took place last month. We will be sharing some concepts or options or scenarios with our community in the next month or so. And there will be a chance to respond to those options, to share ideas, to share questions. And then there will be a third round in February in 2022, where we will refine those options a little further and where we will ultimately get to make some recommendations to the different leadership entities in the schools, the city, and the library to approve this process or to approve this plan. So that's just some insight into what the timeline or what the future holds for this process. With that, I would definitely like to open up the floor and the chat box for people who have questions, thoughts, or ideas. I'm going to stop sharing so see each other. And Harmina, if you could help moderate the chat, that would be helpful if people have questions or thoughts. Thank you again for inviting me to speak. I look forward to the conversation this evening.
So the first question we have here is, what are you doing to solicit input from Shaker teachers? I think their input is vital.
Thank you very much for that question. It's a great question. And actually, a couple of days ago, we agree. I think our teachers, and I would add our students, are in many ways in the best position to help share with us both, input on what our current facilities can or cannot support, and also ideas about the future. So a couple of things. First of all, a couple of days ago, we sent out a survey to all of our faculty and staff and our students, our high school students, to encourage them to provide input into some of the questions we're discussing tonight around our facilities and our facilities' ability to meet modern needs and what the future should hold for our facilities. We also have created an advisory committee that is comprised of stakeholders from across the city. It's not just a schools advisory committee, it's a full Forward Together advisory committee, which includes a number of different teachers as well as students. Again, we found that their input, both teacher and student input, was particularly valuable in this process. As the process unfolds, I expect that there will also be additional opportunities for teachers and students to share their thoughts and ideas, either electronically or in person, through, I guess, essentially focus groups or other opportunities like that.
Okay. Dr. Glasner, the second question is, what is the time frame for execution of the plans?
Well, in an ideal world, usually from the time a school plan is proposed, we then would have to go to our community to ask for funding. So there usually has to be some kind of ballot issue for our community to approve or not approve. So that would take place in November or May or in the spring election season. Once a ballot issue is approved for schools, it's usually a 2 to 3 year construction horizon, meaning, by the end of 2 or 3 years, there are renovated or new buildings that are complete. That also, though, can depend, on the specifics. Do we have to create swing space? Do we have, can we do everything at once, or do we have to go through a phased process? In terms of the larger Forward Together process, including city facilities and library facilities, although the library is in a little bit of a different boat, that could be a longer process. We may have a process that phases things in. So, maybe within 3 to 5 years, we will have addressed some community needs. But maybe within 5 to 10 years, there will be some additional changes made or related to city facilities and how they interact with school facilities. So long story short, that is part of the discussion that we're having. What is the timeline for execution and implementation? But if I was just talking about the schools, typically it's about a 3 year horizon if a ballot issue is approved.
The next question is, has there been any conversation about creating a learning community face hub in Shaker's densely populated areas of apartment dwellers to better serve those student community needs?
I am thrilled that you asked that question because really that's exactly the kind of ideas that we're hoping this process generates. And really, that was kind of where I was hoping we'd get to when I asked that question. How can we reimagine or rethink our community assets to create neighborhood hubs? We know that many of our schools serve as neighborhood hubs, and we think there are opportunities for other kinds of facilities to create neighborhood hubs that could be green space or athletic space or, you know, other recreation type facilities. But the kind of facility you're referencing in your question is also an opportunity to create some kind of family and community engagement center or hub for families in some of our more densely packed neighborhoods. I will say one of the benefits we've seen of the Forward Together process so far has just been the increase in collaboration that we've already experienced with the city and with the library. As a result of some of those conversations, we have decided to move our registration office and our family and community engagement office to the main library. They're going to be moving actually just in a couple months here, because we think that the main library is an excellent access point and much more accessible for many families. And will also, when families come to register for school, they may also, or enroll in school, they may also get a library card or get to see all the wonderful services our library provides. Or when they come to access support or services through our family and community engagement office, they will also get the support and services that our library provides. So that's just one example of how we're thinking in similar lines or along similar avenues. And we hope that this process generates more ideas like that so that we can continue to build community and provide access to families in all of our different neighborhoods.
Are there any more questions or comments? There was a comment about the last comment that you made, Dr. Glasner, about moving the offices into the main library, and the comment was great idea.
Oh, that's great.
I agree. The next question is, if it hasn't already been asked, how seriously is a district considering closing a school building, including Woodbury? Yeah.
Thank you very much for the question. It is certainly part of the conversation that we need to have for a couple of reasons. We know that we have too many buildings right now, just in terms of our overall footprint as compared to school student enrollment, and that our buildings are not built to meet modern student needs. In that conversation, we have to consider whether consolidating some of our buildings is part of the steps we need to take. I expect that the concepts or scenarios that we will be asked to provide input on in the next month will include some school buildings being closed or repurposed for different types of programming. Specific to Woodbury, I know this question was specific to Woodbury or including Woodbury. That I can't say right now. It's too early in the process. But you know, generally we are, this part of this process to look at all of our facilities and how we can make sure that we're fiscally responsible in the facilities that we have.
Okay. Related to that, the question is, in addition, will there be a conversation around grade configurations, or will the spans remain the same?
Thank you. I'm thrilled that you asked that question because it's a really important point, and I should have addressed in my last question, in my last response. So thinking about our grade configurations is also part of this process. One of the things that has emerged, actually, I would say kind of pretty early on in the process, just in terms of the input we've been getting, is that the way that our current grade configuration exists does not necessarily support the building of strong relationships between students and adults. The probably clearest example of this is our 2-year buildings. We have Woodbury in grades 5 and 6, and then go to the middle school for 7 and 8. And that's a lot of transitions for students to make in a short amount of time, and without the opportunity to have long-term relationships with students and staff in the building. So that is certainly one thing that we're looking at. I would say the second part of this equation related to grade configurations has to do with pre-K, pre-kindergarten. We have heard many of our community members and students and faculty have all talked about how important pre-K services are. I see Mr. Foreman is in this call, and I know that he and our Onaway team provide a lot of support for our pre-K program now. And we have more people who want to be a part of our pre-K program than we currently can accommodate. We also know that the federal government right now is considering some kind of universal pre-K program. So we want to be prepared if that happens, which I hope it does. It'd be fantastic. And if we have, if we're able to expand pre-K services, that will also require us to rethink our grade configurations, either to include pre-K, you know, across more buildings, or to include a separate pre-K facility. Those are some of the conversations that we're having.
Dr. Glasner, I get a lot of questions from families as it relates to how does a final decision get made as it relates to the collaboration between these organizations, these entities, and how does that work?
Thanks, Mr. Foreman, for bringing that up. It is a great question. And we've built a couple of different groups to facilitate that final decision-making process. I'll use the school board as an example, but we'll be able to apply the same process across other entities. So over the course of the next couple of months, we will be soliciting and generating community input and engagement. The advisory committee, which is a representative group of all different stakeholders, will be looking very closely at that input and working with city, schools, library staff to develop a set of recommendations based on the input that will then be shared with elected and largely elected and appointed leadership. In our case, that would be the school board. And so once that recommendation is developed, the school board will have an opportunity to approve that recommendation or not to approve that recommendation. That same process will be taking place with the city council and with the library board. We're in a slightly different position as a school district, only because there are some specific approvals that our school board has to go through for the Ohio Facility Construction Commission that the city council and the library board do not have to go through. But either way, all of the different entities will have an opportunity for their elected leaders to vote to approve or modify a final plan.
Dr. Glasner, there's a two-part question here. Are there any specific ideas yet for what potential renovations to Thornton Park might include? And also, is a dog park being considered as a potential community hub?
Thanks for both of those questions. So just a little bit of context while I answer this question. The city facilities that are part of this process include Thornton Park, the pool and the ice rink, also the Sussex building, as well as the Stephanie Tubbs Jones building that's next to the library, or also known as the community building. Those are really the three main city buildings that are part of this process. But of course, there are other buildings or facilities that are kind of more tangential or indirectly involved in this process. In terms of Thornton Park, I mean, the same questions we're talking about with our school facilities are also questions that we're talking about with Thornton Park. You know, first of all, what purpose, you know, kind of what is the overall purpose of Thornton Park? Is it located in the best place possible? Should we be looking at renovation or replacement of Thornton Park? Should it be a centralized kind of facility, or can there be parts of it that are decentralized? You know, should tennis courts, for example, be in one location, or should we think about tennis courts in one place, maybe basketball court in another place, maybe the pool and the ice rink together somewhere? If Thornton Park moves, what could that site be repurposed for? So these are all the kinds of questions that are part of the Forward Together process, and that will actually be, I believe, at least some ideas of what could happen to Thornton Park will be included in the concepts or scenarios that are presented to the Shaker Heights community within the next month or so. I will say the dog park idea, I know, is something that a number of different people have provided input on or suggested be a part of our facilities as we move ahead. So I know that is certainly on everybody's radar as we think about facilities moving forward. And certainly the idea of making, you know, maybe that kind of facility could be a community hub or in one of our other areas in Shaker.
Okay. Dr. Glasner, the next question is transportation also considered facilities? For example, the idea of a shuttle to transport community members without their own transportation to city building facilities?
So access is definitely a part of the conversation, you know, where facilities are located and who has access to it and how they have access to it. I mean, we do have a public transit system, which provides different levels of access to different parts of our community. So, but in thinking about where facilities are located, you know, like recreation facilities, for example, how close or how accessible are recreation facilities by transportation? I will say, when I first heard this question, I thought it meant a little different. One of the topics that's come up is our Shaker bus depot, our school's bus depot, and where that's located on Lee Road. We know that it's important for economic development for Lee Road to continue to experience economic growth and development, and that might mean looking at different places for our bus depot and bus garage. That's something that we're talking about with the city, even though it's not one of our school buildings. It's certainly a part of the overall economic development and growth and planning for the future of the Shaker Heights.
There is another question here that says, can Thornton Park be turned into a rec center? Since the idea is that maybe ice skating isn't something that would draw a lot of people to the facility.
So thank you very much for that question. You know, I know that we have a strong and dedicated community of ice skaters and hockey players here in Shaker, and Thornton Park actually gets used, the ice rink gets used quite a bit. It's not regulation size, so I know that's been an issue. But, you know, this idea of, you know, should we maintain an ice rink? If so, where and how do we make sure it's sustainable? Because right now the capital investment needs for Thornton Park are pretty extensive. And this idea of maybe turning it into a rec center or rec facilities. You know, I think this idea of recreation facilities has come up a lot. Again, whether it's at Thornton Park, the location of Thornton Park, or elsewhere, it's something that I know is high on the list of priorities as we move forward with this process.
Dr. Glasner, another question is, will the high school, will it be remaining in the same general location, or is relocating the high school under serious consideration? And if so, to where?
You know, at this point, everything is on the table. You know, of course, I think there are parameters that we have to operate under. I think it's possible, and I don't know this yet, it's possible that some of the scenarios will look at different options for our high school in terms of location. But that alone comes with pretty substantial costs. So moving a high school is a pretty involved process. And if so, where? I mean, it's a little too early for me to say that, although I will say there aren't a lot of open spaces in Shaker to move high schools to. So, you know, there aren't lots of big plots of land. I will say, just in that same vein, one of the kind of discussions that we've had to have or calculations we've had to make is thinking about our current buildings and how much to invest in our current buildings while this process is going on. The library has had to have similar conversations. So with Bertram Woods Branch, the library intentionally decided to postpone the renovations for the Bertram Wood Branch until there's more clarity around some of the options that we'll be looking at. That's true for the schools as well. So every day we often face decisions, you know, in order to maintain our buildings, to create warm, safe, and dry locations. There's money and investments we have to make in our buildings to keep them running. We also know that until the master planning process is complete, you know, we want to make sure we're not investing dollars to make long-term changes to buildings that may look different in 6 months or a year from now or 2 years from now. So that is definitely a consideration that we kind of balance the daily needs and the current needs of our students and our staff in buildings, while also knowing that a long-term planning process is underway. Is it okay if I ask a question? Not for me to answer, for everybody else to answer. You know, one of the things that we've talked about is how best to engage community members in this process. And I'd love to hear people's thoughts. Having opportunities like this is fantastic. I also know that there are lots of people who aren't here in this meeting. And if folks have ideas about things that we should be doing to engage our community members in this process, I would ask specifically also, you know, one of the things that we know is important is engaging and representing communities or members of our community that have typically been marginalized or underrepresented. So if folks have ideas, I know that's something we've talked quite a bit about, and I'm happy to share some of my ideas, but I'd love to hear from folks here what ideas you have about engaging our broader community in this conversation.
I have a comment. My name is Jill Christoph. I work for the architecture firm that actually is designing the library at the moment. And I was a part of the community engagement that we did there. And there were a number of times where we actually just were at the library physically and had a bunch of different images and asked people to kind of just place a sticker on types of spaces that they were looking for. And I think we got a lot of different feedback for that. And just being there in person at different times of the day, we received a lot more feedback than we were expecting.
That's great to hear, Jill. Thank you. Thank you very much for that idea.
Good evening, Dr. Glasner. Thanks for the forum. I think when you asked the question about marginalized members of our community, just thinking about focus groups, I know you all have done those before, but maybe connecting with principals to identify families who might not typically come to these type of Zoom events or come to forums, who have a lot to say, but don't often feel comfortable in just attending meetings. I think just being able to handpick some of those families will be really great. I think as a Mercer parent, thinking about the Mercer community and the Moreland community and ensuring that there's a complement of both families' voices. And oftentimes we have to reach out to accommodate for that.
Thank you, Lisa, and very much agreed.
Dr. Glasner, there is one last question here, and it's regarding remodeling versus new construction. And I think they're asking, how is that looking for the
it is a little early to tell. I will say in our first survey that we did about a month ago, many of you may have taken, we asked that question, kind of what would you prefer, renovation or new construction? A lot of folks said renovation, and I believe that's for two reasons. First, and I think most importantly, a lot of people, I think, talked about the idea that renovation is probably cheaper than new construction. And the second general trend we got was, wanting to preserve the historic nature of our buildings. The reason I say, even with that feedback, that it's a little too early to tell is because cost assessments may show us differently. I would actually say, based on most of our experience so far, building new is generally cheaper than renovation. And secondly, the idea of, the historic nature of our buildings, we believe that it's possible to build new and also maintain some of that historic nature. So I think as this process unfolds, we'll get a little more clarity around that question. But at this point, just to be clear, both renovation and new construction are certainly both on the table, and may wind up being a little bit of both. I will say kind of a big caveat is it really depends on what our community is willing to support from a funding perspective. Ultimately, our community members are going to have to decide whether to approve some kind of bond issue that will support renovation and new construction or not. And if not, we'll have to, maintaining our current buildings as is not really an option. So we're going to have to think of other ideas if a bond issue is not approved.
There is a comment here that says, love the suggestions to do some in-person connections, small meetings, focus groups, etc., to get community feedback. Please use mediators when needed to ensure that all voices are heard.
Thank you very much for that suggestion, and I very much agree. Our advisory committee, which is made up of stakeholders from across the community, they have been trained and will continue to kind of go through training to learn how to facilitate meetings in neighborhoods, with very much that idea in mind that, having people with close relationships in neighborhoods to their friends and neighbors is the best way to ensure that all voices are heard, and to make sure that we have people who are experts at, making sure that that is the case. So we are also working with some consultants who are helping provide that kind of support, but I very much agree that making sure that we have structures and facilitators are inclusive of all voices is critical. I know that I believe we're out of time. I want to respect everybody's time. I know there was a meeting before this meeting, so I know this is been a longer PTO meeting. I really appreciate everybody's time, thoughts, and ideas. If you have other suggestions or questions as this process unfolds, please do not hesitate to reach out. I also want to thank, especially I see a number of our principals and other faculty here, just a special shout out and thank you to all of you for all of your work making our learning and teaching happening on a daily basis.
I also would like to just thank everyone for joining us this evening, and a very special thank you to Ms. Jones and to Dr. Glasner for the time that you've spent with us today. It's been very enlightening, and thank you both for your efforts in making our schools and community better each day. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good night.
You too.